Good morning. Grace, peace, and mercy are yours from the triune God. Elijah is worn out. Before we meet him in this reading on Mount Horeb, he's had a heck of a few months. He has been commanding the Israelites in their worship. He has made flashy public sacrifices to prove the prophets of Baal wrong. He has killed all those prophets from Queen Jezebel. He does all these things as part of his ministry, as part of how he sees himself serving God. And now, Queen Jezebel has declared her desire to kill him. Elijah flees, terrified, and he hits his breaking point. It all seems too much, too overwhelming. He has an important place of leadership among the Israelites, but everything seems too pressing, even to the point that his very life is at risk. And before he makes it to Mount Horeb, he had fled into the desert and just laid down and prayed that he would die. He's at the end of his rope. He's burnt out. He's bone tired. He wants and he needs rest from this weariness, and he just doesn't see that coming anytime soon. Then a messenger from God comes to him after he has given up hope, after his drive to keep on in this struggle has worn out. And that messenger, that angel, strengthens Elijah with food and drink so that way he might make yet another journey, this time to Mount Horeb, a place associated with Moses. And so Elijah eats and he drinks and he walks for 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Horeb. And when he gets there, what we see today, he encounters God, but not in the way he expected to. Moses had encountered God in a pillar of fire by night and a pillar of cloud by day. Perhaps Elijah expected to meet God in the wind or in the fire or in the earthquake. But of course, God was not in those things. And Elijah could not hear God's voice over the clamor of that wind or that fire or that earthquake. And yet still, Elijah needed to get in touch with God in that moment. God's messenger had been able to strengthen him for 40 days to make this journey to Mount Horeb, but that messenger could not revive Elijah's bone-deep weariness. That messenger could not help Elijah see a path forward once he had given up all hope. Elijah needed to connect with God in that moment because he was more than just normal body tired. After his work in those last few months, he was tired deep in his very soul. He had worked with people who were starving, literally and figuratively. He had prayed to God to end a drought, and he worked against existential changes in his own community, all while battling Queen Jezebel and her Baal-worshipping court. He had witnessed death and destruction, and he was beginning to lose his own sense of purpose and call. He was tired in his very soul, and he needed God, God's comfort, God's presence, and God's assuring wisdom that there is still a way when we see no way. He needed to hear that still small voice. And he needed time to grieve and process everything he had been through. But his life was too loud to hear that voice of God. There was wind and fire and that earthquake which covered up God's voice. But his own life and its pressures were too loud for him to be able to grieve and process like he needed to. There was just too much on his mind. It took silence for Elijah to be able to know that God was still present in his life, still forging a path forward for Elijah, even as he felt too weary to continue. And in God's endless mercy and compassion, God gave Elijah what he needed most: utter silence. Quiet enough that he could hear that still small voice of God. And after he was able to sit in this silence and meet God there, he took his ministry in a different direction. Immediately after being in Horeb, he goes and he finds Elisha, a much younger prophet that he begins to lead and guide. He found a new call in that silence. So what do you need to grieve from this year? What do you need time to process? For many of us, we have lost loved ones or jobs. We have lost opportunities to have weddings and days together. Some of us have lost time with friends or even employment. And now, nearly all of us are experiencing this difficult time together. Many of us need quiet to grieve everything we've lost and process everything we've been through in these last few months. But despite our great collective need, the world around us seems to insist on rancor. They seem to insist on focusing on the wind and the fire and the earthquake. And that noise is so loud that we cannot hear that still small voice that we need in this moment. Or maybe for you, rather than something personal, what you need time to grieve and process is more on a national scale. We as a nation need quiet so that we might discern how that still small voice is leading us from here. How do we as a nation move forward towards equity and reparation in our national life? How do we move towards economic and racial justice? And what is it that we have lost in our discord, in our division? What have we lost in this pandemic? What have we lost in the pandemic of racial injustice? But instead of listening to that still small voice as a nation, our national conversation focuses only on destruction. We need to find God in our midst. We insist instead on focusing on that wind, that fire, and that earthquake. But like Elijah, God is ready to hand us the gift of silence when we are ready to listen. And today I'd like to do something a little bit different, and I'd like to end this sermon in a moment of prayer, in silent prayer. I invite you to a time of silence to consider what it is you need to grieve in this season, whether it is a loss in your own life or a trouble in the life of our nation. This will be a short silence, only 30 seconds, but it might feel longer. I invite you to sit and stay with it, even if it gets uncomfortable. And in this time, I invite you to simply consider what it is that you need to grieve and process, and to listen for that still small voice guiding you forward. This is a singing bowl used for meditation. I'll ring it to mark the beginning and the end of the silence. So I invite you to get comfortable. Take a deep breath and listen. Lord, all these things which have come into our hearts and minds in prayer, we now commend to you, trusting in your love and mercy and presence. Amen.